Good morning. Here I am with Pearl. Hi, Pearl. Um, it's Wikipedia's birthday today. So yesterday I was at a celebration at the Columbia Library, and I was there all day. I got there at like 10 a.m. I got home at maybe 11:30 at night. Um, Fun day. Okay, we're on. Last time I very conveniently stopped at the start of chapter 3, so it's the top of page 48. As a senior at Yale, Moses had decided to go on to Oxford. He had wanted to go as a Rhodes Scholar, but every third year the prestigious scholarships were not awarded, and 1909 was a third year. The system was changed in 1916. Unwilling to wait until 1910, and with no financial need to, he paid his own way. Asked in later years why he had chosen Oxford for his post-grad work, Moses would shrug and say there had been no special reason, but his choice turned out to be an apt one. He was to find in Oxford a spiritual home. The marriage of Bernard Cohen and Rosalie Silverman had been a marriage of brilliant mind with brilliant mind, and of idealism crystallized in a desire to improve the lives of the lower classes, with an overweening arrogance. The strain of brilliance, idealism, and arrogance had surfaced in the daughter, Lady Bountiful, and had been passed on through her, undiluted, strong but somewhat formless, to her son Robert. Oxford, using the brilliance as catalyst, was to refine the other two ingredients in the strain. 2 years among her spires and statue-crowned columns, her quadrangles and cloisters, her towers that had whispered to Matthew Arnold the last enchantments of the Middle Ages, would boil the fattiness out of the idealism, rendering out of a vague desire to help people not only a clear, definable concept of public service, but also a specific means of performing that service. 2 years among her richly paneled halls, her ancestral tankards and inland croziers, among begowned processions led by beadles carrying silver staves, and among gardens tended by 1,000 gardeners, would, would distill the arrogance, potent though it already was, and make it still more potent by adding to its essence a philosophical base. The British belief, firm indeed in the early 20th century and epitomized in the trappings and teachings of Oxford, in the duties and the rights of those born to wealth and privilege. Oxford of 1909 was the castle keep of British conservatism. The key to its ancient gates was wealth. In the year Robert Moses entered Oxford's Wadham College, the university was largely closed to the student whose family was not rich. Conservatism characterized the attitudes of its students, including the 90 Americans among them. When 3 months after Moses' arrival, an American club was organized, its first meeting featured two speakers who said, respectively, "We are as much interested in anyone in preserving Oxford as a home of English conservatism and tradition." And, quote, "We should carry into the bustle and stir of the new world the atmosphere of the old." Uh, I keep yawning. It's really not that early, but I don't know. As strong as Oxford's conservatism was its emphasis on public service. Its tone in 1909 had been set for the preceding 3 centuries by rich young men who were sent to the university as a preliminary to public life and who, from positions in Parliament or the civil service or the learned professions, actually did, after graduation, govern Britain and its vast territories overseas. But the leavening of devotion to public service, with an unabashed insistence on the rights and privileges of aristocracy, could not help but make that devotion somewhat patronizing, infusing it with a strong air of condescension and a noblesse oblige in its most obnoxious form. It was a refined, more subtle, but also more deeply rooted version of the attitude of the German Jews of New York toward the Russian and Polish latecomers, of Bella toward the children whose parents didn't even know how to bring them up, so they would be able to properly clean the cabins Madison House had been kind enough to build for them. Bella's son was very happy at Oxford. His most frequent companion was Mal Dougherty, his friend from Yale, who was also studying at Wadham. Quote, Bob had a very good time at Oxford, Dougherty recalls. He liked it very much. It was such a relief after Yale. Yale had that pseudo-democracy, but it was not democratic at all. It was snooty, with all that social tradition. When we got to Oxford, we found all this changed. It was understood by everyone that by the very fact you belonged to Oxford, you were the select and the elect. You didn't have to compete for prestige or honors to become one of the elites. Because you were there, you were the elite. Moses' understanding of this fact, and his acceptance of it, shone through an article he sent to the Yale Alumni Weekly. There is a moribund institution for workingmen's sons somewhere in Oxford, he sneered. I have never yet met an undergraduate who knew its exact location, nor have I met anyone who did not become incoherent with rage when it was defended. Moses liked the gentleman's life that Oxford offered. Breakfast, lunch, and tea were served in the students' rooms, and they were encouraged to entertain friends, of whom Moses had plenty. Says one classmate, Bob was almost universally loved. The first American in history to be elected captain of the dark blue water polo team, he was also swimming captain, although, as at Yale, if he ever won a race, the victory went unrecorded. Taking up debating, he became president of the debating society at Oxford's Wadham College. Hello. Oxford's exemption of students from all marks and tests, except for a single all-inclusive examination given after 2 years, appealed to the student who, even at Yale, had refused to be bound by the confines of his courses. The Oxford education confers on the average undergraduate independence of mind, he wrote in the Alumni Weekly. Vacations were an especially happy time. Moses and Dougherty spent their vacs on walking tours of England or traveling abroad, often with Moses' roommate, John Gilbert Higgins, a Rhodes Scholar from Newfoundland, who spotted a long knitted scarf and a thick Irish brogue. In Switzerland, the youths tried out a sport that was just beginning to attract the attention of the American tourists, skiing. In Italy, Moses saw again the frescoes and statues he had loved as an undergraduate and spent hours being gondolaed around Venice, a city with which he had fallen in love. Every summer, his family would sail to Europe and take a large suite of rooms in a hotel overlooking the Lake of Lucerne. There, Moses and Dougherty played tennis, swam, and climbed the mountains. In 1911, a Rhodes Scholar named El Alail, the son of an Egyptian boy, invited Moses and Dougherty to visit Egypt. Crossing the Mediterranean on a leaky, shuddering tub named the Equator, the youths found themselves in the company of hundreds of Levantine natives and a troop of women Dougherty describes as an international tarts sailing for the winter season in Cairo and Alexandria. On the first night out in Marseille, the Equator's captain selected one, disappeared with her into his cabin, and remained there for the rest of the 4-day voyage. The same procedure was followed by every other officer except an aged quartermaster. The engines broke down, along with the latrines. But when the ship and its attendant Aroma arrived at Alexandria, El Alail ensconced Moses and Dougherty in luxury. The three youths spent the day swimming on a magnificent beach at the mouth of the easternmost branch of the Nile, and evenings chattered over dinner with the highest British colonial and native Egyptian officials, including the Khedive of Egypt. The Khedive must have been impressed with Moses. He asked him to be his secretary. If you just came, it's chapter 3, and so far it's details about Robert Moses at Oxford that seem, even for this book, a little in the weeds. You didn't miss much. The mark of Oxford's influence would be plain on Robert Moses for the rest of his life. Oxonians habitually wore bags, old flannel shirts, old flannel trousers, so long unpressed that they were completely shapeless, and sweaters or heavy tweed jackets. The academic gowns required for lectures were often worn along with bedroom slippers. Moses, who had always been exceptionally neat in dress before Oxford, would return to New York affecting a carelessness about attire that at times went to extremes. Insisting he needed only one suit, he would wear it until it was shiny. He had only one pair of shoes, which he never shined. Returning home on a rainy day, he would sit in front of the fire in the Moses' luxurious living room, holding his feet close to the flames, making a point of telling friends he couldn't go out again until his shoes had dried because he didn't have another pair. He obtained new underwear and socks only when his mother bought it for him. After his marriage, his wife would take over this chore, and since he refused to go to clothing stores at all, she would select the suits herself, have them brought to their apartment, and arrange for a tailor to come and fit them there. And if Moses was to return from Oxford with a somewhat studied indifference toward clothes, he was to display the same attitude toward money, an attitude which some friends felt, from remarks that Moses made, was an attempt to imitate the scions of British nobility he met at Oxford, who had never thought of money because they had no need to. His family first saw this attitude on board the luxury liner Potsdamer in the harbor at Southampton, where they had just picked up Robert before going to Lucerne. When Emmanuel began to tell his son about money that had been deposited for his Oxford expenses in a London bank account, Robert, who previously had had a normal college boy's interest in his allowance, said loftily, "I don't want to talk about things like that." The affection that may have underlain this attitude is suggested by another trait that became apparent at Oxford, a seeming compulsion to pick up checks to be the host at every gathering. Doherty, who was not in need of subsidy, recalls, if you went anywhere with Bob, to lunch or dinner or to have a drink, he'd grab the check and just insist on paying it. It got so people felt a little annoyed. But if you grabbed one first, you'd have to sort of squabble with him about it. That's crazy. Hello, welcome. Yeah, if you're coming in, it's literally just him at Oxford doing normal Oxford grad school behavior. Nothing crazy, except for now that he picks up all the checks. I think that's very interesting. Oxford was also influencing the young man on a more significant level. In long letters to his parents, he said that he definitely decided to dedicate his life to public service. On his return to the U.S., he said he would make a career in government. He even had his field picked out. He intended to become an expert on the renowned British civil service so that he could inculcate its principles in America. Government pay might not be high, he said, but he didn't care about money. Bella Moses read the letters to relatives with approval. And while Oxford was refining and strengthening Moses's idealism, it was having the same effect on his arrogance, which increasingly took the form of galloping Anglophilia. Moses's admiration for things Oxonian broadened into an admiration, strikingly deep, for all things British. Coupled with this feeling was one of almost scorn for things American. Writing to the Yale Alumni Weekly in praise of the single examination Oxford system of education, he went beyond the praise to say, "I hesitate to imagine the introduction of such a scheme in the U.S., whose intellectual independence is safeguarded by daily recitations." There was another overtone, too. Under the influence of Oxford's conservative insistence on the rightness of the British system's provisions for keeping the reins of government in the hands of a highly educated upper class, Moses came more and more to admire that system. Such admiration, of course, postulated as concomitant, an amiable contempt for the capability for government found in members of the lower classes, which in this context included everyone not a member of the British nobility. And from this attitude, it was a logical step to reserve supreme contempt for those whom the British aristocracy considered most incapable of self-rule, the people of the nations British troops had conquered, which meant, in general, people of color, brown, yellow, or black. Moses took this step With agitation for increased self-governance in rising Great Britain's colonies, Oxford in 1911 sponsored a World Congress on Race Problems. I really want, if only there were a video of the 1911 World Congress on Race Problems. And it was going to examine the question, along with the broader question of general discrimination by Great Britain against people of color. Delegations were sent by the colonies and by liberal organizations from many European countries. American students selected Moses to represent their country because of his reputation as a debater. Previous speakers had pleaded for equality, for fraternity, for immediate brotherhood. Moses' point of view was somewhat different. Immediate brotherhood, he said flatly, was not practical. The subject peoples, he said, of the British Empire were simply not ready for self-government yet. Furthermore, he didn't see any time in the near future when they would be. As the audience realized what they were hearing, a certain restiveness began to develop. When Moses started explaining quite clearly why he didn't think the subject people would be ready for self-government for a long time, several subject people rose and charged at him. One step ahead of them was roommate Higgins. He grabbed Moses, shoved him through a door at the back of the speaker's platform, and hustled him out of the building. That was the most exciting part so far. The climax of Moses' academic career was the thesis he submitted for a PhD degree, the Civil Service of Great Britain. The thesis contained no torch divine overheard. The floridness of Moses' Yale poetry and prose style had turned hard, cogent, and marvelously lucid at Oxford. Short, hard sentences must have carried his profession through the intricacies of parliamentary infighting and regulation, rewriting with refreshing ease. Whenever they do construction on the tracks, the train does a really loud horn, and it's always very loud from my apartment. Okay. He displayed not only a complete familiarity with a bewildering array of bureaucratic technicalities, but a gift for the felicitous phrase. Describing Carlyle's appeal to Parliament to muck out the Augean stables of bureaucracy, Moses wrote that Carlyle appealed with excremental eloquence. Macaulay's speech on the need for promotion by merit was, he said, the most masterly vindication of the principles of competition ever left unanswered. Not only Moses' prose style, but what was behind the style had hardened, too. The all too conscious revelation in the thesis pages of what the British civil service symbolized to Robert Moses demonstrated that 2 years of Oxford had solidified the cast of mind formed in the mold of heredity and upbringing. The youth who had been raised in an atmosphere pervaded by a mixture of idealism and arrogance had found the rationale for such noblesse oblige in the British theory of rights and duties of upper classes. The thesis with which he laid the capstone of his education focused down on the British civil service as the embodiment of this attitude, the practical result of this theory, and he saw the result as glorious. The thesis reveals its author as a man convinced that public service is a noble calling and that one must be based on the highest ideals. Moses did not believe that the perfection of the British civil service system was an end in itself. Rather, he saw it as an instrument, an indispensable one, for the implementation of great social reforms. Progressive nations, he wrote, had begun creating new departments of government to free mankind from the traditional horrors of old age, disease, and unemployment. These new departments, he said, must have leaders and personnel with outstanding qualifications if they are to fulfill their noble purpose. His idealism is further documented by his admiration, an admiration that approached idolatry, for the uncompromising reformers. Trevelyan, Northcote, the genius Macaulay, who had fought to make the civil service equal to the new demands, and by the vehemence, the sincere, deep passion of the phrases with which he described the patronage system that had been the reformers' chief obstacle. There's just so much information about his PhD. Okay. Quoting descriptions of the incompetents whom patronage foisted upon the service, Moses cited a report which concluded patronage is the worst form of bribery, and concurred with feeling the incessant demands of office seekers and the contemptible meanness and petty irritations attendant on distribution of favors are, he said, intolerable. Merit and open competition, he said again and again, should be the sole basis of appointment and promotion in public life. Mingled with this idealism, of course, was the arrogance. It was subordinate to the idealism. If the idealism was displayed in Moses's convictions about what should be done, the arrogance emerged only in his convictions as to who was best suited to do it. But it was every bit as pure and uncompromising. The civil service of Great Britain reveals its author as the possessor of a depth of class feeling and conservatism more appropriate to a retired colonel of the Guards than a young progressive from New York City. Open competition may be what the young author said he wanted, but the openness was to certain individuals only. Merit may be the determinant he said he desired, but it was not merit based on a man's handling of his job. The competition Moses wanted was a competition only open to a highly educated upper class. The merit he was talking about was merit not in public service, but in the education given exclusively to members of that class. What Moses admired in the British civil service was that it had two separate and distinct classes, a very small administrative and policy-making upper division reserved for university men, and a much larger lower division consisting of clerks of ordinary education, selected through examinations on the high school level, who do the lower and more mechanical work. The class differentiation that Moses admired was a rigid one. Carefully placed technical hurdles made it difficult, almost impossible, for a young man, even one of dedication, industry, ambition, and talent, to rise out of the lower division. Brilliant, Moses called this step. Far-sighted. It attracts into public service precisely the men most needed there, the most intelligent and capable young men in universities, he said, and it keeps them in government by reserving for them posts from which they can exert real influence and authority. Was there, perhaps, a question as to the democracy of such a system? Moses' answer was that civil service was no class differentiation. Civil service with no class differentiation is one of mediocrity, and such democracy is false democracy. What about the young man who educates himself, who goes to night school, perhaps, and earns a college degree while he is in the lower division of the civil service? Might not he be considered fit for promotion? Well, Moses said, also, just so you know, there's like 2 more pages in this, and then get ready for this. A whole new section 2, the reformer. So I'm just going to read the next 2 pages, and then it'll probably be right at 30 minutes. And if not, I'm going to quit anyway. Also, my cat is like scratching things over there. Hi, Pearl. Let's see if she'll come. Okay, so what about the young man who educates himself and tries to earn a college degree while in the lower division? Might he not be considered fit for promotion? Well, Moses said, my conclusions on this difficult question of democracy versus education in the civil service are these. In a sense, it is a cruel thing to set up class distinctions, even if they are only intellectual. But where does our sympathy lead to? Can the state repair the defects of heredity or of early education? Can it endow the average individual with the intelligence, acuteness, and cultivation with which economic exigencies have denied him? There should be no social bar to promotion from the lowest to the highest place. But let us not fool ourselves. When we have made every possible provision for the encouragement of early promise, when we have prepared every child as far as possible for its suitable vocation, the subordinate employees of the government who are fit to rise above the ranks will be few and far between. As for recent complaints of the lower class civil servants about wage scales and working conditions, Moses said there was no need to worry about those subjects. Quote, the writer believes, in spite of Mr. Wowling and his socialistic brethren, that the civil servants may safely depend upon the public parliamentary reputation of the justice of his cause, upon the fairness of the treasury or a minister, and upon royal commissions, to get real grievances redressed and reasonable demands granted. Okay. What was of more concern to the writer, in fact, was that the lower class workers might not understand this and might continue agitating, might, in fact, even form unions. Hopefully, a sense of loyalty would stop the workers short of such an act of open rebellion, but this should not be the case, Moses said. In the last analysis, there must be the remorseless exercise of the executive power of suppression and dismissal to solve this question. The last chapter of Moses' thesis is a plea to his own country to adopt the British standard for its own civil service. The chapter is pervaded by contempt for the standards of government service in the U.S., where spoilsmen and job-hungry politicians lurk everywhere, where we have been so busy fighting for a full realization of the competitive principle that the great problems of division of intellectual qualifications and attracting the best men into our government departments have been quite neglected. That was a quote from Robert Moses. So that the government is staffed by a very miscellaneous and oft ill-educated division of clerks. Patronage must be eliminated and an upper division created immediately, he said. To follow Moses' suggestions, the United States would have had to close the U.S. would have had to close almost completely the higher ranks of government service, not only to all men without a college degree, but to all men without a degree from an Ivy League college. In fact, by the logical extension of Moses' philosophy, graduates of Columbia, Cornell, Brown, Dartmouth, and Penn would be allowed in those higher ranks only by sufferance. In his view, governments in America should be ruled, as was football at the time, by men whose birth and breeding had allowed them to attend one of 3 colleges, only 3 ones, Princeton, Harvard, or, of course, Yale. That reminds me of this thing. I don't know if it's true, but I read it when maybe like 10 years ago, I read a book by Al Franken, and he said that Ted Cruz, when he was in law school, started like a study club for people that had gone to undergrad at only Princeton, Harvard, or Yale. He cut out all the lesser Ivies. I don't know if that's true, though, but I read it in a book about 10 years ago, so maybe. Okay, one more page. Moses said in his thesis that he feared that America's acceptance, Pearl's covering the book, America's acceptance of this suggestion would be delayed by its exaggerated concern for equality. Most men are simply incapable of handling the demands of government service, Moses said, and the time has come for Americans to realize it. We must decide, the young author said, how much encouragement we may honestly offer to those who expect to rise from the ranks without almost essential early education of the university man. Moses saw only one real hope for his country, the fact that a man who met his high standards, Woodrow Wilson of Princeton, had just been elected president. Wilson's writings, Moses felt, show not only a clear understanding of the defects of our civil service, but also a keen realization of the executive leadership necessary to remedy them. Moses had begun the thesis after graduation with honors from Oxford in June 1911. After a last summer in Lucerne, he spent the fall of 1911 doing research in London. Then he spent a term studying political science at the University of Berlin, returning home to New York in the summer of 1912. That's crazy. He got a PhD in 3 years. Very fast. He moved back into his old room on Central Park West. It was the height of his one suit, one pair of shoes, period. But Bella at least made sure that the suit was an expensive white tropical from Brooks Brothers. And Moses began writing. He enrolled in Columbia University's School of Political Science, but took no courses formally, spending most of his time on the thesis, which he completed in the summer of 1913. As soon as he finished it, and even before he took the oral examinations for the Columbia PhD he was to receive. He entered public service by getting a job with the Training School for Public Service of the Bureau of Municipal Research, a private fact-finding organization located at an office building at 261 Broadway, which was about to become a virtual arm of the city government. Robert Moses's education was over. He was beginning the career in public service about which he so often had talked about with so passionate an idealism. The quadrangles of Oxford were behind him. Instead of cloisters, there would be the arena. And one day, in the summer of 1913, he dressed in his clean white suit. Robert Moses carried his bright, shining idealism down to 261 Broadway and flung it on the table to find out what it was worth in the game of life. The end of section 1. Section 2, The Reformer. Next time. Okay. That last chapter was, maybe it's just me, that was the most boring one we've had so far. I didn't really care about anything he did at Oxford. Maybe it's just because I didn't have coffee. Okay, page, oh boy. Top of page 59. So we're still really averaging 10 pages a day. Not bad. By this rate, I'll finish by early May. I did the math earlier. Okay, look at how far. It's really not that much of a dent, but I still feel proud of myself. Okay, goodbye. Happy birthday, Wikipedia. Everyone say bye, Pearl.